In recent years, the word narcissist has taken on a life of its own. What was once a clinical term used carefully within the field of psychology has now become a widely used label in everyday conversations, especially when discussing difficult or painful relationships. At first glance, this shift might seem like progress. More people are becoming aware of manipulation, emotional abuse, and unhealthy relational dynamics. They are naming behaviors that were once confusing or invisible. They are finding language for experiences that previously felt isolating. But something subtle and potentially dangerous has been happening beneath the surface of this awareness. The term narcissist is no longer just descriptive. It has become accusatory. It has become definitive, and in many cases, it has become dehumanizing. There is a difference between recognizing harmful behavior and reducing a person entirely to that behavior. That difference is where nuance lives, and nuance increasingly is being lost. Part of the problem lies in how easily complex psychological concepts are simplified when they enter mainstream discourse. In clinical terms, narcissism exists on a spectrum. At one end, there are common human traits: self-focus, the need for validation, moments of defensiveness. At the other end lies narcissistic personality disorder, a structured and deeply ingrained pattern that affects how an individual perceives themselves and relates to others. The distinction between these levels is not trivial, it is essential. Yet in everyday usage, this distinction is often erased. What follows is a flattening of reality. Someone who struggles to communicate emotionally becomes a narcissist. Someone who prioritizes their own needs in a conflict becomes a narcissist. Someone who fails to meet expectations becomes a narcissist. The label expands until it loses its precision entirely, turning into a catch-all explanation for interpersonal discomfort. This simplification is not random. It serves a psychological function. When people are hurt, confused, or emotionally destabilized, they naturally seek clarity. They want a coherent narrative that explains what happened and why. A label like narcissist provides that narrative almost instantly. It organizes the experience into a clear structure. There was a problem, there was a cause, and that cause can be named and externalized. There is relief in that, a sense of closure, a feeling of having figured something out. But clarity that comes too quickly is often incomplete. When a complex relationship is reduced to a single label, important questions disappear. Questions about patterns, dynamics, and mutual influence are replaced with certainty. The ambiguity that might have led to deeper understanding is removed, and in its place, a fixed interpretation emerges, one that is emotionally satisfying, but not necessarily accurate. This is where demonization begins, not with anger, but with certainty. The belief that one fully understands the other person, that their behavior can be entirely explained by a single trait or diagnosis, creates a rigid lens through which all future interactions are interpreted. Every action becomes confirmation. Every flaw becomes evidence. Every disagreement reinforces the narrative. Over time, this lens hardens. It stops being a tool for understanding and becomes a filter that distorts perception. The consequences of this distortion are not limited to how one sees others. They also affect how one sees oneself. When all responsibility is assigned to the labeled individual, there is little incentive to examine one's own role in the dynamic. This is not about blame in a moral sense, but about awareness in a psychological sense. Relationships, especially dysfunctional ones, are rarely one-dimensional. They are systems of interaction, shaped by both parties, even when one side is clearly more harmful. Avoiding this complexity may feel protective, but it comes at a cost. Without reflection, patterns remain unexamined. Without examining patterns, they tend to repeat. At the same time, the act of demonizing another person has a deeper psychological effect. It reduces empathy. Once someone is categorized as fundamentally flawed or toxic, the motivation to understand them diminishes. Curiosity is replaced by judgment. Their actions are no longer interpreted within a broader human context, but as predictable expressions of a fixed identity. This shift is subtle but significant. Empathy is not just about kindness, it is about accuracy. It allows for a more complete understanding of behavior, including its origins and functions. When empathy is removed, understanding becomes shallow, and shallow understanding leads to poor decisions. There's also a paradox embedded in this process. Many people who strongly reject narcissistic behavior place high value on emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and psychological insight. Yet the act of rigidly labeling others contradicts those very values. True emotional intelligence requires the ability to hold complexity, to recognize that people can be harmful and still be human, flawed and still understandable, difficult and still shaped by factors beyond immediate observation. When this complexity is denied, thinking becomes binary. People are either safe or dangerous, healthy or toxic, good or bad. This kind of black and white thinking may feel efficient, but it does not reflect reality. Human behavior is rarely that simple, and when perception becomes overly simplified, misjudgments increase. This has practical consequences. Individuals may begin to interpret neutral or ambiguous behaviors as malicious. They may withdraw from relationships that are imperfect but not inherently harmful. They may approach new interactions with heightened suspicion, expecting patterns that are not actually present. Over time, this can lead to isolation, mistrust, and a narrowing of one's relational world. Ironically, the attempt to protect oneself from harm can create new forms of disconnection. Another layer of complexity emerges when considering that narcissistic traits are not exclusive to a specific group of people. They exist, to varying degrees, in everyone. The need for recognition, the desire to maintain a certain self-image, the tendency to become defensive under threat, these are not abnormalities. They are part of the human psychological landscape. What differentiates pathological patterns from normal traits is not their existence, but their rigidity, intensity, and impact on functioning. When narcissism is framed as something entirely external, something that only other people possess, self-awareness diminishes. It becomes easier to overlook one's own tendencies, to ignore subtle behaviors that might contribute to conflict or misunderstanding. This creates blind spots, and blind spots by definition are difficult to detect without deliberate effort. The danger here is not that people become narcissistic in a clinical sense, but that they lose the capacity for self-reflection. And without self-reflection, growth stalls. None of this suggests that harmful behavior should be tolerated or excused. Boundaries remain essential. Recognizing patterns of manipulation, emotional invalidation, or control is critical for psychological well-being. In some cases, distancing or even complete disengagement is the most appropriate response. The issue is not with identifying harm, but with how that identification is conceptualized. There is a difference between saying, "This behavior is harmful and I need to protect myself," and saying, "This person is entirely defined by this behavior." The former allows for clarity without distortion. The latter sacrifices accuracy for simplicity. Maintaining this distinction requires effort. It requires tolerating uncertainty, resisting the urge for immediate conclusions, and remaining open to the possibility that initial interpretations may be incomplete. These are not easy tasks, especially in emotionally charged situations, but they are necessary for maintaining both psychological clarity and relational intelligence. As the cultural conversation around narcissism continues to evolve, it is worth considering the long-term implications of current trends. If the label continues to be used as a generalized accusation, its meaning will continue to erode. More importantly, the habit of reducing complex individuals to simplistic categories will extend beyond this specific term, affecting how people interpret behavior more broadly. This trajectory does not lead to greater understanding, it leads to fragmentation. The ability to navigate human relationships effectively depends not just on recognizing patterns, but on interpreting them accurately. It depends on balancing awareness with nuance, protection with openness, and clarity with humility. When any of these elements are removed, perception becomes skewed. Demonizing narcissists may feel justified in certain contexts. It may emerge from real pain, real confusion, and real attempts to make sense of difficult experiences. But when it goes too far, when it replaces understanding with judgment and complexity with certainty, it creates new problems. And those problems do not remain isolated. They shape how people relate to others, how they interpret behavior, and how they understand themselves. In the end, The goal was never to become better at labeling people. The goal was to become better at understanding them, not in a way that excuses harm, but in a way that allows for accurate perception, effective boundaries, and genuine growth. Because without that understanding, even the most well-intentioned awareness can become distorted. And when awareness becomes distortion, the outcome is predictable. It ends badly.